to work by animal traction, 40% grade vineyards on slate at 1,000 meters of altitude that are 45 minutes away from anything else. All the best producers are going more and more into more geographically specific bottlings.
Hey, this is Harman Skurnik, and welcome to Skurnik Unfiltered. Today we have a bonus episode that I'm joined by our illustrious Iberian portfolio team, led by Max Working. Hey, Max.
What's up, Harman?
And his ambassador, sounds very diplomatic, Matt Wolfe.
What's going on?
Lobo.
Trying to teach you the diplomacy part.
Yeah, we're working on it still.
You guys just returned from a trip to Spain and Portugal, which are the two Iberian countries that you guys live, breathe, and eat. How was it?
Amazing as always. At the helm of this portfolio of the company, I end up traveling a lot more frequently in Spain than Portugal. So it's always nice to get back to Portugal. But Galicia, this northwest corner of Spain that is directly adjacent to northern Portugal, is just one of my absolute favorite parts of Spain. I'm always banging the drum for it, trying to interest more Americans in getting off the kind of beaten path of your more typical Spanish destinations to get there.
Otherwise known as the green Spain, isn't that right?
Literally, the landscape is physically greener due to higher rainfall, lusher vegetation than what most people think of as Spain, like more Mediterranean.
When you think of Spanish wine, you have a sort of stereotype in your mind. Galicia is not really that stereotype, is it?
I think that there's a shift happening, if not already entirely happened, mainly due to the popularity of the grape Alvarinho, which I think is now becoming synonymous with the other kind of famous two or three either styles or grape varieties of Spain. But I think that people, to Max's point, I think people are consuming it, but not necessarily traveling to the place where it's most famous.
Or they may not even know where it is.
Yeah, truly.
Aren't the grapes grown like right on the water?
Yeah, in most cases. One of the things we talk about, I think, kind of holistically about wine globally is what elevation are the vineyards at? Wow, it's so cool. The plateau over Barra del Duero is at 900 meters above sea level. It doesn't feel like it, blah, blah, blah. We're on top of Tié in Tenerife. We're like touching the moon. And then in Salnes, it's like we are at 1 foot above sea level. So I think generally it's just kind of this mystical place for people to experience. And I mean, historically, people know about it globally because of Santiago de Compostela and the pilgrimage finale there, the end point. But that's for a much different purpose than agriculture and viticulture.
But that proximity to the sea kind of lends itself to the salinity and the minerality of that wine, doesn't it?
No doubt. I think that the style of wine that today's, let's say, more informed drinker is looking for, oftentimes lower alcohol, a little more acid driven. The coasts, of course, are a good place to seek this out. There obviously can be a little bit more insulated from the effects of climate change. So absolutely.
It's funny you mentioned elevation before, but if we talk about Galicia and elevation, we might be directed towards the red side of the equation, which is the Mencía grape and Ribera Sacra and Bierzo. You visited there as well, right?
Yeah, it's a good point that even within this one small corner of Spain, you've got zero altitude seacoast up to snow-capped mountains. And that's what, we saw in Ribera Sacra in interior Galicia. It's funny. It's the first time, I was telling Matt this when we were in the car driving from Orense to Pobra de Trives in the middle of one gloomy night, and the fog turns to sleet, turns to snow, and we're swerving off the road to avoid hitting some jabalís, which was actually a first for me on the roads of Spain.
Wild
boar strike almost. And it occurred to me this is the first time I've been to this part of Spain in winter. It's like there are certain parts of Spain, because of the travel calendar, that we just associate in our minds with the dead of summer, not necessarily for any reason other than a logistical reason, but to be in interior Galicia in Ribera Sacra that has these infamously death-defying slopes that look like the Mosel or Côte Rôtie.
The roads themselves are kind of death-defying
They certainly can be.
with ice and snow.
But to see that in a context of frost-covered trees and the snow-capped mountains in the distance where there's like literally a ski, well, in Spanish they call it a ski station. I don't know what the English term. Do we have ski stations? I don't ski. Ski resort?
ski
I feel
either.
like resort is
Yeah,
the wrong
what?
word, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Estación de ski. I don't know.
A place where you ski.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So since we're talking about Ribera Sacra, do we want to talk a little bit about your visits? Dominio de Bide is there.
Yeah, I want to hear Matt's take on Bibe.
I mean, Bibe is great. I think it's one of those if you know wines or wineries, I suppose, kind of tucked up in the Quiroga Bibe subzone and is this magnificently popular winery within Spain.
It's popular in the Skurnik household as well, I'll tell you
The wines are superb, and there's a long lineage of historic, groundbreaking winemakers that have passed through those doors, namely Sara Perez, who now operates the Venezuela Universal project in Montsant with Renee. But we got really lucky that day. The rain kind of stopped and the sun opened up, and we just had this magnificent trip in this incredible area, just really making our calves work, walking through these very old vineyards clinging to the hillside, and then like finally driving to the top of the hill and discovering this very brutalist design of a winery that is dug into the hill in 5 kind of nuanced levels so that the winery can completely operate by gravity. And then had maybe one of the most intimate tastings we've had in a long time in the basement of the winery, in a room with 30-foot ceilings and dark, kind of sultry lighting.
I guess, again, it's kind of because of my professional specialty. It's like I don't go to Burgundy every winter to taste out a barrel necessarily or whatever. So I often associate, again, like I was saying earlier, of like tasting at wineries with other seasons, but yeah, to get down into the bowels of the earth in winter to taste both new wines and also bottled wines, it's like this deep, like telluric experience.
Totally. And in that case, you feel so sunken, right? And then you walk out of the door and you're like, oh, I'm still on top of a mountain. That was a really special visit.
What were your impressions of recent vintages in the Ribera Sacra, Bierzo area?
Specifically, 2 of the newest vintages that we'll be releasing, which doesn't sound new to our typical release calendar, but we'll be still seeing more 21s coming out of that region, which are superb. 21 being like a fresh, classic year in a lot of Spain. And then 22s, which is, as it was in a lot of Europe, a little hotter and drier, but good producers made perhaps more structured, but albeit fantastic wines. That winery is a bit of an exception because of their long élevage regimen, et cetera, et cetera. But we could talk definitely more about 24s and 25s from coastal Portugal and also Rias Baixas, where there's a lot of those under our belts that in many cases will be coming out quite soon.
Okay, well, why don't we move down to the sea and talk about Rias Baixas?
Vamos allá.
Who did you visit down there?
Well, so after crossing the border from Portugal, which, it's funny because you're in the north of Portugal, you're already in Alvarinho land. So you're already kind of like, even before you get to the Minho River, which is the border there, you kind of feel it approaching almost.
A lot of people don't understand that Alvarinho is in Spain. Alvarinho is pretty much the same grape variety in Portugal, right?
There's, like, to be honest, I'm not academically versed in the state of studies of clones and genetic diversity, but I think that it's accurate to say there's still debate about the origin, but that it probably came from the Salnés Valley of Rias Baixas in what is now Spain. So before we go to Spain, though, on the subject of Alvarinho, the Portuguese version of the grape, this is not something that we can ever have a conversation about without talking about Selma Mendes, the great producer of that grape from the north of Portugal. Somewhat infamously, his nickname over the years has even become Senor Alvarinho, Mr. Alvarinho. So he's got in the São Melgaço area in the far north of Portugal, this spectacular estate vineyard of contiguous 50 hectares of Alvarinho, and the very, very choicest parcels from this amazing property are going to be cuvées like Expressões, and most recently, something that we've only just been able to start bringing into the USA, a wine called A Torre, first ever commercial release, 2019 vintage. And it's so just simply a stunning wine, one of the greatest expressions of this grape from any producer, of any country. So that was really something to behold from a guy who really since the late 90s has been nearly synonymous with top quality Alvarinho in Portugal. But Alvarinho, even in the context of the far north of Portugal, Alvarinho is not the only thing in white grapes, because you've also got Loureiro, which is not nearly as well known, but it's becoming, I think, a little bit better known. But this is actually a little south of the border between Spain and Portugal, maybe 30 minutes driving. You're going out of the Minho River Valley and down into the Lima River Valley. And even in that short drive, the cultivation just flips entirely over from this one grape to this other grape. And so that river valley, the Lima, is the home of our great friend Vasco Croft of Afros. What more can be said about this estate that was the first ever certified biodynamic wine producer in the country of Portugal, still only one of 4 to this day, including our friends Philippe and William, or one of the other 4. It's funny because sometimes you just have no idea what novelty you're going to uncover at his address. And this time around, what it was is that, so Afros for years now, they've had a sort of subset of their wines, the Faunus label, which they use for some of their very most lo-fi, let's call them, and medievally inspired, minimal input creations, including several wines which are made without electricity. And it says it right on the label. For a couple of those wines, for years, they've been running literally a hand crank manual crusher destemmer. That's one of the most beautiful pieces of, winery equipment that I can think of, among any of my producers. It was actually made in the Azores many, many years ago, and he picked it up somewhere. The novelty this time around was this beloved old hand crank crusher destemmer. They hooked it up to a bicycle. So now, and it's funny because it's like their cellar hands are like rejoicing, because instead of hand cranking this thing in shifts for hours and hours and hours and hours to destem and crush the Loureiro grapes that are going into the Faunus skin contact Amphora Loureiro, they're able to rip through it and just in half the time using their legs instead of their arms. They still have to do it in shifts, but with many producers, we talk about returning to the past to move forward. And it's just funny because you're like, well, there's the big innovation, is they hooked up the manual destemmer to a bicycle. So that was pretty amusing. But yeah, so then you cross over into Spain proper and you start crossing through the so-called Rías of Rías Baixas. And Rías, people often ask what it means literally. And it's kind of, I would almost describe it as imagine a fjord, but transposed into Spain instead of Scandinavia, and maybe a little lower to the ground, like not so cliff-like and high. But back to your question, we visited Manuel Moldes, affectionately nicknamed Chicho of Bodegas Fulcro. And then later, always on these trips, it's like things sometimes can go sideways for a few days in terms of changing plans and moving around and who's in town and who's late and blah, blah, blah. But after going into the interior and hightailing it back, we caught Churcho Alba of Alba Mar. So 2 fantastic growers there.
Most of the growers in the Skurnik portfolio I have had the pleasure of visiting, but I have not yet gotten to Alba Mar. What makes Alba Mar special? Because those wines are incredible. I mean, every single one of them is outstanding, and I'm just curious what makes that winery so special.
Like many of the great growers in Galicia in general, Churcho's from the area. His family's from the area. He has his roots there. and loves it. I think that was another thing that was interesting in a lot of the conversations with him, is when he was showing us his vineyards, many of which he's purchasing fruit from because of the amount of money that farmers can charge for Alvarinho nowadays. But he's just so giddy and happy and excited, and he's just like a kid in a sandbox that's really, really infectious. And I think he has a very specific mental idea of kind of what the new generation of farming looks like in Rias Baixas and in Salnes. And I think most uniquely, he brought us right to the coast, right next to the vineyards that are planted for one of our favorite wines, Alma del Mar. And he had planted new vines that he's working completely biodynamically with total natural regeneration. And that is like completely unheard of in this area that is
very few producers can do it. And some of those, if they're fully committed to it, they end up losing harvests.
Is that because the climate is not so conducive to?
It's because of mildew pressure, because of how wet it is. Yeah. It's like the balance of the grapes, in a good year is fantastic, but you just have to pass through this gamut of threat of that. But it's funny because Churcho, in one of these newer parcels that he's working in this way, was telling a funny story about some bureaucrats were passing by, on the carretera at the side of the vineyard during a time when they were doing biotreatments. And the agents or whatever, they saw out of the car window that they were treating without a, like a World War I, trench style mask on, which is what you need to wear when you're treating with like regular chemicals. And so these people, they stop the car, they jump out and they run to the vineyard and they like, they're basically about to like arrest them more or less for like sending people into the vineyards to treat unprotected. And they're like, guys, like, you got the wrong idea. Like, this is a horsetail solution.
Yeah.
And there was like this standoff. And according to Churchill, like one of the vineyard guys literally had to like uncork the tank off his back and took a swig out of it, in front of these guys to prove like that it's okay, and they eventually like, were like, okay, and like drove off. So this is like, that's the reality of farming in a still marginal, even in global warming area. And, this comes up for us a lot because I don't know about you, Matt, but I feel like it's not infrequent that we will get requests for like, I need an Alvarinho for, whatever price, name a very low price. And it's like, it's got to be organic, and you're just kind of like, a lot of people don't know the reality, the economic and climactic reality of like, if you want organically grown Alvarinho, for example, from this area, like it's rare and it's expensive. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, and then just one other point that I think both Chicho and Churcho do is very, very site-specific wines, which again is generally unique in this area. And it's really fascinating to look and drive through all these vineyards. And he's like, I have 2 rows over there, and I have 4 rows over there, and I have 5 rows over there, and this. And you kind of get this, microfundillo.
The mini fundismo of Galicia is this crazy. You talk about small parcels and land holdings being divided up into very small individual pieces of ownership. And that exists in a lot of places, but the degree to which it exists in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula it's like nothing else.
You're looking at it, he's like, yeah, I use this for the entry-level wine, and this goes into this. And then he's like, and those 2 rows of vines, Chicho would be like, yeah, that's Nas Dunas.
And he makes like 50 cases of it?
No, 1 barrel.
1 barrel.
One 350-liter barrel. But yeah, all of the best producers there, and Chicha from Fulcro that Matt's talking about is another one of them. Like all the best producers are going more and more into more geographically specific bottlings.
Let's talk about Bodegas Fulcro, which is relatively new to the portfolio. And from what I understand, Manuel is his mentors or people that he's respected and learned from is Raul Perez and Rodri Mendez. Is that accurate?
I mean, I would say, yeah, definitely those 2. And there's more too, like, Jose Luis Mateo from Quinta da Muradella is another one of his old wine buddies. But if you had to pick one, it would probably be Rodrigo Mendez, whom he's a great friend of ours. He's also local to the Salmes Valley of Rias Baixas. It's this very small, close-knit community where everybody knows everybody. So Chicho, Manuel, was a kid who, his father started making a little wine at home in the late 80s and registered a bodega with the DO. And it was nothing, no commercial aspirations or anything like that. He was in construction, his father. And in fact, that was how Manuel got one of his most prized vineyards for his wine called Nas Dunas, on the dunes. It was his father built a house for a guy on the beach, basically. And the guy had a couple rows on his property, rooted in basically pure quartz sand. But anyways, yeah, so Rodri, who is really a godfather to a lot of people in Rias Baixas, definitely took Chicho under his wing to a certain extent. And I think a lot of the stylistic elements that mark the Alvarinho of people like Rodri are also Raul, for example. And you could say that, Raul really was the original pioneer of some of these stylistic things back in the early 2000s. Things like harvesting a little bit riper, like not overripe, but like not marginally ripe, not green grapes, like fully ripe grapes, neutral oak, or even oak of any kind, and blocking malolactic. These were things that 20 years ago literally didn't exist. And a lot of the best new producers, these are all now fairly more and more common tactics.
In a sense, isn't it kind of a return to tradition, though? Because prior to stainless steel, there was oak barrels.
Yeah, chestnut.
Yeah, true. Not just oak. That's a good point. The chestnut tree is this kind of almost like totemic tree in the Northwest. We were kind of seeing this a lot and hearing about this, about how, so one of the things, if you're in this part of Europe, that strikes you if you've never been there before is there's eucalyptus trees everywhere, right? And you're kind of like, what the hell is going on here? They were imported. You were like researching it.
We chat GPT'd it, and and they
200
just
years ago, and
took over. Yeah.
So that's clearly, came from outside and is considered basically invasive nowadays. But another thing that is strongly associated with there is the like pine trees, which you also see tons of pine trees. And I didn't know this before, but apparently that also is, came from elsewhere and is kind of blocked out a lot of the more quote unquote native vegetation, of which chestnut is one. So that's a drop down a chestnut rabbit hole, but it's this is the fascinating thing about wine culture, right? But Dominio de Bibe, to return to Ribeira Sacra, they were encircled this year, right before harvest, nearly 360 degrees by wildfires. You may have read about these terrible wildfires that raged through Galicia this summer. And why weren't they touched in Bibe? Because ringing their estate, you have fire breaks where the pine switches over into the native chestnut vegetation and they burn slower. Anyways, where were we?
We were in Spain, but should we head to Portugal? Or do we have more to talk about in Spain right now?
We could go on and on about the abundance of shellfish and the 25 vintage of Alvarinho, which Churcho Alba, he said it could prove to be historic in both quantity and quality. But maybe in the interest of time, we could pop back down across the border to Portugal. On our way back down to Portugal, we did manage to get our shoes muddy in the vineyard that Raul sources his great Atelier Alvarinho from. An amazing parcel that all in, it's probably about 1 hectare, I would guess. The planting age is not known. Most of Spain, they don't have like planting records of dates. It's a sad fact, so it's a lot of guesswork, but this parcel is known to be pre-phylloxera. And Matt, I think that was your first time in it. So
it was huge. These were big vines, and it was funny because I was excited to get in there and snap some photos and do this, and Max is like, whoa, hold on, we don't know like what dogs are on the property, we don't know who is here. This isn't like rural, Pennsylvania, where you can just be like, hey, farmer.
There are some Alvarinho vines that are like 200 plus years old, aren't there? How old are these vines?
Again, it's, they're assumed to be probably the oldest vines on the site, or, maybe 1860s, 70s. But that's guesswork. And not just Alvarinho, but Caíño red grapes also. So a lot of places that you walk around in Rias Baixas, there's a lot of where vineyards verge from the wine vineyard into more ornamental, and there's a lot of that in the area.
He makes a small amount of red from that region?
You basically, from this kind of what I'm describing, it looks ornamental if you're looking at it. It's like off to the side, just a single vine that, the canopy, I mean, is maybe 3-4 times the size of this ceiling of this small room, but like the trunk itself here, and it's a barrel of wine that maybe
From
about
basically one
maybe
vine.
about half of the barrel, let's say. I can't claim it's a single vine wine. One of my colleagues recently, I forget who, was telling us about a single vine wine.
Stolpman
Was it? Oh, it's a Stolpman thing.
from the old Klopp
So
trellis system, right?
So that, so anyways, so the 24 Alvarinho from this parcel we're talking about is releasing quite soon from the winery. So we'll be seeing that in just a couple months, and we're finishing the 23 vintage now. And then, I mean, it would be difficult to talk about Raul right now without talking about his push into ever higher altitudes in Bierzo, in his home region, which is much further inland. And in fact, technically not even in Galicia. It's across the border into León, Castilla y León, where one of his newest projects, Viariz, Viariz, constitutes literally the highest altitude vineyards in the entire Bierzo appellation, that top out at over 1,000 meters of altitude. And we talk about altitude in wine, well, at least in Western Europe, let's say, leaving aside the Andes in South America, which is a whole different thing. Like, you talk about 500 meters is considered pretty high altitude, 600 high, 7, 8. This is getting into eye-watering altitudes, and 1,000 is higher than most of the Alps, and most people probably not even aware that something like this existed in Bierzo with Mencia, but it does. And
most winemakers wouldn't even dare plant at that altitude.
Well, I mean,
they think it's too high.
The thing is that these vineyards were planted 100 years ago. So that's a whole, like, whether or not the winemakers and growers of today would plant is almost immaterial, because they're planted as so much of Bierzo was 100 or more years ago. So that's a fait accompli. But in terms of whether the winemakers want to work with it, great question, And in fact, these vineyards, Raul got them from Ricardo Palacios, Ricardo and Alvaro, his uncle.
And Raul took on the challenge. And I think he's succeeded, hasn't he?
Starting in 2019 is when they started really being able to produce juice from there. And then once the 2020 and especially the 21s, which was a vintage when all the stars aligned in terms of the weather and the grapes,
Somebody gave that wine 100 points. Who was that?
I think a guy, Luis Gutierrez, the Spain critic for Advocate. But so yeah, that's as something that has an outsized importance in Raul's current.
Are the yields
universe.
on those wines just incredibly tiny? I mean, because the wines are super expensive.
I mean, I couldn't quote you a hectoliter per hectare yield, but suffice it to say it's extremely low. But mostly it's a factor of, to work by animal traction, 40% grade vineyards that are 45 minutes away from anything else on slate at 1,000 meters of altitude is it's not cheap. So
yeah, I mean, we talked about the windy roads of Ribera Sacra and how harrowing they can be, but after a lunch of 3 steaks and 7 bottles of wine, when we visited Raul last year, he put us into his small little white truck and put the pedal to the floor so that we could get to Viariz before the sun went down. And that was inspiring and horrifying.
I'll bet.
But I mean, you're just zooming on these tiny little roads up to over 1,000 meters above sea level, and then it's a special thing to behold.
Before we move on to Portugal, can we just get a quick primer on, because Raul makes so many different wines, right? So what is the basic difference between, let's say, the Raul Perez label versus Vizcaína, Castro Candaz, etc.?
Take it away, Max.
at risk of oversimplification, let's say that Raul's principal project, which is called Bodegas y Viñedos Raúl Pérez, is a project that is marked most notably by a labeling element that says Ultreya. Ultreya, by the way, is the traditional greeting of pilgrims to each other on the Camino de Santiago, which I think many Americans are aware of this now, which is cool because it's gaining traction for Americans. But if you don't know, the Camino de Santiago is a ancient pilgrimage trail that leads to the northwest corner of Spain. It was super important in the Middle Ages, and it passes right through Raul's, not just his region, but his home village.
I mean, people walk hundreds of miles
Yeah,
on that.
like people literally, nowadays, the most common one is to walk from basically the Pyrenees to Santiago, which is near Fisterra. But anyways, you imagine that this popular cultural trail passes directly through a village of, about 50 people. Like that's an important cultural fact, right? So that's why Raul labels a lot of his wines Ultrella. It's a reference to the Camino de Santiago. And you have a couple village wines, white and red, Godello and San Jacques, the Mencia blend. And then you also have a number of like much, much smaller production, a barrel, a couple barrels, single parcel wines, Ultrella wines. Then you have some wines called La Vizcaína. And the reason actually that they have a different label is because they're made in an old ramshackle, let's say, bodega in the village of Valtuye, that bodega historically was called La Vizcaína. It's like that's what the building was called. And the wines are raised there. And so that's technically why they say that label on them, because they come from that bodega. What they are is also single parcel wines, but like not tiny, tiny production, medium level of production and price from single liudi, you could call them. That's the Vizcaína. Then, you get into Ribera Sacra in Galicia proper, and we talked about him collaborating with his great friend Rodri Mendez earlier, and Castro Candaz is a project they have together in Ribera Sacra for mostly Mencia dominant reds, of course, and then a fantastic white as well. I mean, talk about rabbit holes. We could keep going down the rabbit hole in terms of other news with Raul, like his acquisition of about 20 hectares of head-trained, dry-farmed, 100-year-old Garnacha vines in Navarra at the Domains Lupier property, which was already renowned in Spain, but the owners put it up for sale in 2021, 2022, and Raul and a partner were able to buy it for the beautiful old Garnacha vines. There's others, but...
So let's move to Portugal, and let's start with our really good friends and incredible hosts, Filipa Pato and William Wouters, a winemaking and chef couple who are incredibly hospitable when you do go to visit them. He's an amazing chef. It's like going to a 2-star Michelin restaurant to have dinner with them. And then, of course, the wines are spectacular. Did you know that Skurnik used to work with Filipa's dad back in the 90s, and there was a kind of a cult following? Luis Pato, he's a pretty famous producer.
And contextually, I think it's important to note the different style of wines that Filipa and William produce compared to Luis's wines. If we want to roll into an old world stereotype, his wines, I think, follow kind of a Bordelaise direction, in which Filipa and William's wines are slightly more delicate. They almost feel like the Alto Piemonte of the old days to me. But again, to put it into real perspective, I mean, these are like true hospitalitarians that not only care deeply about their story and the people that they share it with and how they share it with them, but also the vineyards that they work and how they take care of them. Incredible biodiversity in all the vineyards, incredible animal work in all the vineyards that is supported by sheeps that help keep ground cover low and pigs that help maneuver and aerate the ground, and these really inspiring vistas when you're driving through the vineyards of Bairrada and you kind of see the parcels off in the distance, and you can tell Filipa and William's parcels because they're bright green. And there's some gray ones and some brown ones. And then she's like, that's ours. And we're like, yeah, we can tell.
You can tell because of their farming, you can tell that their vines look different than their neighbors.
Yeah, they're very purposeful about every single thing they do. And another testament to just who they are as people is, we arrived to kind of a new, I don't know, effectively it was a storage facility that they're kind of renovating amongst some of their parcels. And one of their friends showed up who happens to be one of the most important distributors of coastal seafood and shellfish.
And grower of oysters. Yeah, oyster grower, shellfish distributor. This is the friends that they roll with, thankfully.
Hugo.
So.
He showed up with about 3 dozen Portuguese oysters, and we had some wine. And
Luckily, Felipe makes a nice sparkling wine to have with them.
yeah, it was really, really special. And they're just great people. And probably one of the greatest honors, not only of the trip, but of our life, was later that evening when Max and I were inducted into a very special group of people. Confraria de Vallada.
We have to thank our friends Felipe and William for basically standing godfather to us on this, because, you know, that they, if not for them, like we would not have been hooked up.
Tell us about this. I see this tastevin around your neck here.
Yeah, so I think this is not all that uncommon in like very old traditional wine regions, that you have these sort of cultural groups that develop around the appreciation of the wines. And like, you know, in Burgundy, there's it's like, you know, the confrérie de chevalier of, you know, the tastevin. So it's like that, but in Bairrada in central Portugal. So most Americans, of course, would never have heard of this. And, you know, we hadn't heard of it either until, to be honest, Felipe and William were like, funniest thing, the very day that we have fixed for this, that evening, is, you know, the induction of this year into the Cofradia dos Xenófilos de Bairrada. It's like, do you guys want to do it? And we were like, yeah.
You mean they nominated you like on the spot?
No, like in advance, but like, you know, so, and we had to like submit our CVs and, you know, they had to vet us, you know, so if anyone has ever been traveling in kind of central Portugal there, and there's a famous hotel in the mountains, kind of right in between Dao and Bairrada, the Busaku Hotel. I remember I first learned of this hotel's existence in one of those old editions of the Jancis Robinson and Hugh Johnson's like World Wine Atlas. On the Portugal page, I don't know if it's still there, but the photo on the Portugal page was this like stunning, you know, neo-Manueline architecture like building that is like this hotel, and they make wine there. And for many, many years, you could only get the wines, these Busaku wines, at the hotel restaurant, or like, you know, buying at the door to go. Nowadays, that's changed, and they put a little bit into distribution, like a tiny little bit, but still, for the most part, like you can, you know, more or less only get the wines at the hotel there. Anyway, so this stunning architectural historical marvel up in the hills there outside of Bairrada is the venue for this induction ceremony, which is, yeah, as Matt was saying, is done all in, you know, Hogwarts style black robes, and they're very thick, and the room is filled, and it's very, you know, hot, and it's like, you know, it's this whole, you know, the petitioners that year, they all come up and a little spiel is given, and then there's a Latin formula that we had to memorize and spit back. So,
well, it's pretty good timing that you were there that day.
And it was Max's birthday, or at least that following
when
night.
The clock struck midnight.
So we got inducted, and we had a 4-hour dinner, and then we all got on the patio and we sung Happy Birthday to Max. And
now we come back to defend Baga.
Correct.
Because, you know, now it's like
we must.
For those of you who aren't aware, Baga is the main grape from Bairrada.
It's always been huge in central Portugal and Bairrada. But the thing about Bairrada is that for most of its history, and even still today for many producers, you're talking about a bulk sparkling wine region, which they utilize their clay limestone soils and their temperate climate close to the Atlantic to produce fresh, balanced, tasty, low alcohol sparkling wines. And it was Luis, Felipe's legendary father, who was the one several decades ago who first broke that mold and was like, we're not going to do bulk sparkling wine. We're going to do world-class, terroir-driven, some whites still, but largely reds based on the Baga grape. And that's the work that Felipe and her husband are continuing to such spectacular effect.
You mentioned Dow before. Should we move on to Rivella wines?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, the morning after our inductee ceremony, we traveled to the kind of granite plateau of Dow to visit our newest Portuguese producer, Mariana Salvador, who makes the wines at Rivella. And we were able to view some very old vineyards of Alfrocheiro and Cruzeiro, and we talked about Jaén, which is the kind of Portuguese synonym for Menthia. And Mariana has been this kind of like budding superstar in the world of Portuguese wine, especially over the last year or two, and has spent time as the head winemaker at Textura, which is a fairly celebrated winery in the Dow, makes still wines in Madeira for Barbeito,
Protege of Luis Sabra also.
protege of Luis Chiabra, and just like a very in tune, passionate, talented winemaker. And luckily in 2024, she was able to acquire a generous amount of space to increase her production from, I think we currently work with 3 wines in which about 1,100 bottles of Alfroshero were made as her highest quantity. 400 or 500 bottles.
That's under 100 cases.
More is coming.
Very, very tiny. But now
Stay
because
tuned.
of this acquisition of this winery and a few more old vine vineyards, we're really, really looking forward to sharing the love of not only Mariana, but the quality of the wines in 2026. It's something that we're really looking forward to.
Great. What are the wines like? Are they white and red?
Yeah, so we work with an Alfroshero, 100% Alfroshero, which is a unique kind of almost forgotten variety in the Dow. And she has this very delicate approach with the wine, utilizing carbonic maceration in a few different iterations and making this fresh, bouncy, energetic expression of Central Portuguese red wine that still has some spice and herbaceousness. And
Kind of Cru Beaujolais.
It's, yeah, it's better. And then 2 white wines. She does a mono varietal Encruzado that feels very bone-like, Beaune, not Bone, and is just quite sultry and has just the perfect proportion of minerality and salt and dried tropical fruit and these kind of white pepper elements, and then kicks it up a notch with an old vine white blend across a few different areas of the Dow Plateau, and the wine sees a kiss of new oak and is just like a testament to her vision and the quality of wines that come out of that area for that price point. They're really, really exciting.
So our last stop in Portugal was the historical port producer Kopke. I have been to Porto, to their old winery there, but I have not been to the vineyards. Tell me about Kopke.
So like a lot of the historic port producers, they have a spot in town in Vila Nova de Gaia across the river from Porto. And then the vineyards are all, of course, up into the valley. The parent company of Kopke, the Kopke Group, they own a couple of other port brands, but their vineyard source for Kopke and some of the other ports is called the Quinta São Luís. A beautiful north-facing, so the south slope of the Douro River, which is increasingly important nowadays. The Douro is one of these places where we talk a lot about the effects of climate change because it's so hot there in the summer. And it's in northern Portugal. It's not like in a Mediterranean part of the country, but just because of the way that there's a sort of mountain, the Serra de Morau, I think, like blocks it off from the Atlantic, and just the way that that weather gets trapped up in there in the summer, it's so hot. So the bottom line is north-facing vineyards, critical. And Carla Tiago, who's the technical director of the group, is just a firecracker, like super winemaker, so dialed in. No one else in the entire valley has the wealth of wines stored away that they have, which is really the envy of the rest of the valley. Because we talk about like Ribeira Sacra earlier, these amazing steeply sloped riverbank vineyards, and it's easy to forget almost for Americans, I think, who are not historically big port drinkers, compared, for example, to English people who historically have consumed tons of port. For them, if you ask your average English wine enthusiast, name an amazing, riverbank vineyard area, they're going to think Douro, obviously. Americans maybe aren't thinking that so much. So that's like the OG death-defying slope growing area. And the incredible thing about it is it's not just a small little stretch of river. It's just kilometers and kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of just insane scale human terraforming over history. And then to go back into town in Gaia where, to see the how many liters or the big Balseiros, where they're holding wines before they kind of move them into
6,000.
barrels. I mean, it's
they're
just colossal old barrels that only a few people in Portugal even know how to take care of these anymore. And
Kopke is one of the oldest porthouses, or the oldest porthouse, right?
the oldest existing still porthouse dating to 1638. Just an amazing wealth of history to poke through.
On that note, I think we should wrap. But it was been a really great conversation.
And you've been a great traveling.
It was awesome, man. It was really a blessing, but great conversation. Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
Nice chatting. Later.
Enjoy.
Skurnik Unfiltered is recorded at Skurnik Wines and Spirits headquarters in the Flatiron District of New York City, which is why you might hear some city noises as we go along, like horns honking. If you found the conversation interesting, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a review. You can stay up to date on our show and upcoming events by following Skurnik Wines on Instagram and visiting our website at skurnik.com.